So now what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at the results of this investigation. Who wants to guess what happens? So, Chapter 32, A Shadowy Picture. On October 30th, 1919, Staff Sergeant Herbert Darlin from the Regina Depot Division called in at the Office of Vital Statistics and in very short order held in his hand the marriage certificate of one John L. Wilson, mounted policeman, to Jesse Patterson of Blaine Lake on September 29th, 1918. So that's their official day that they got married. He then drove to the Regina Burial Company and found no record of the death of a Mrs. Wilson, nor did Regina City Hospital have any record of her. Then through a connection of Miss Lane's, that's Elaine, who he'd found in the phone book, Sergeant Darlin contacted Thelma Wilson, Mrs. Lane's daughter and Polly's old school friend. No, that's not Elaine. Whoops. I'm glad there's finally something being done about Polly. Thelma Wilson told him. Yes, her husband said. We wrote to the police about it ourselves about 3 months ago, but never heard anything. Do you know where Polly Wilson lived while she was in Regina? Sergeant Darlin asked. Yes, certainly. Thelma Wilson said eagerly. It's a boarding house on Rose Street. I'll take you there if you like and introduce you to her landlady, Miss Wismer. She can tell you more than I like. Would you call and see if she can see us now? As soon as they were seated in Eileen Wismer's dining room with the sliding oak doors closed for privacy, Eileen had set out teas and cookies. Sergeant Darlin, a tall, dark, 32-year-old Welshman, seemed an unlikely stenographer as he flipped open a notebook to record Eileen's observations. Eileen Wismer gratefully spilled out everything she could remember about Polly and Jack Wilson. Where's my coffee? Crap, where was that? Here we go. How he treated her, never taken her anywhere public, and Polly's discovery of Jesse Patterson's letter. She described the morning Polly left on the train at 8 or 9 o'clock, accompanied by Mrs. Hanson. She looked worried, as if she didn't want to go. She didn't know anyone in Saskatoon. She talked about Polly's baby, due in January, and her promise to write, and she described Wilson's late-night visit soon after she left. I thought it was strange, sending Polly off like that on her own when he planned to come down so soon himself. He took some mail for Polly. Did she receive a lot of mail? Oh yes, every week she heard from the children in their own handwriting, and she was always writing to them and her family. She loved those children. Sergeant Darlin wrote energetically, funny little squiggles, slashes, and dots all over the lined notebook. The late fall sun caught a beveled mirror edge, reflecting a rainbow onto the white tablecloth. It's such a relief to be telling you this. I've been going over and over it in my head for a year now. I can't get those children out of my mind. Just last week, I got a letter from Polly's sister, Nellie Hutchinson. I haven't answered it yet. What could I say? Do you have the letter? Indeed, I do. It's right here. Eileen got up and retrieved a letter from the drawer in the sideboard. Those poor people are nearly crazy with worry. Take it with you if you want to. I have the address. Thank you, Sergeant Darlin. Pocketed the letter. Oh, and this pitiful one from Jack Wilson last winter, asking me to take Polly in. You can have that too. Sergeant Darlin scanned the letter. I wrote him back and talked to him of religious matters, him being so near death and all. I should have known not to believe anything he said. I never trusted him, I'm sorry to say, even if he is a policeman. And again, just further evidence, we know he was lying about this. I will be dead by next spring, according to the doctor. Sergeant Darlin smiled as he wrote that down, but I have every confidence in Miss Wilson. She is straightforward and honest as day. Can you think of anything else, Miss Wismer? Sergeant Darlin asked. No, but I'm sure I will as soon as you're gone. Darlin closed the book and stood up. Thank you, ma'am. You've been a great help. They stood chatting a moment in the sun-warmed veranda with its brown wicker chairs and wicker table piled with newspapers and magazines. Still blooming geraniums lined the windowsills. Polly loved this room, Eileen Wismer said. We'd like you to not mention my being here to Sergeant Wilson, should you happen to receive a visit from him, Darlin told her. Oh, don't worry, she replied. I often had to play double with him so he wouldn't know I knew about their troubles, but I'd be hard put to be civil. Eileen drew a huge breath of relief as she watched the sergeant walk down the sidewalk to his car, opening the door so courteously for Mrs. Wilson. At last, something was being done. Probably too late for Polly, she had a feeling, but at least they'd find out what happened. The day Sergeant Darlin spoke to Mrs. Wismer, Superintendent C.H. West Commanding Officer, F Division in Prince Albert, discovered Polly Wilson's trunks stored away in the Prince Albert Express office. So if you remember, those are those trunks that they never caught. They were stored for a year. Commissioner Perry gave orders to have the trunk seized and their contents listed. One of the trunks contained bedding, a teapot, 6 silver spoons, cutlery, a small saucepan and jug, a pair of corsets, black woolen socks, gray wool socks, a man's felt hat purchased in Regina, and a few other sundries. The other trunk revealed a Royal Northwest Mounted Police serge tunic with corporal chevron, a field jacket and pea jacket, dress boots and spurs, felt hat, breeches and dress pants, a patchwork quilt, 1 flannel, 2 cotton dresses, underskirts, and men's and women's shoes. There were also 2 enlarged photos and a number of snapshots, which West judged to be taken in Blaine's Lake District, and the last letter Wilson wrote to Polly, instructing her to come to Saskatoon on September 27th. West forwarded the letter and snapshots, registered mail, to Commissioner Perry. The night train from Regina arrived in Saskatoon at 7 o'clock the next morning, and Sergeant Darling stepped out, eager to see what the day would produce. He wanted to talk to the occupants of 217 9th Street. So that's the address that Wilson had listed, right? Any mail that goes for Polly, hey, Eileen, could you just send it to this address? Where Wilson's next of kin, Mary Wilson, had lived, according to Wilson's re-engagement papers. At the Saskatoon detachment, he found that Miss Amelia Foster was the present resident of that address, and Mrs. Foster confirmed by telephone that the Wilsons had lived with her the previous fall. Posing as an old friend of Jesse's, Sergeant Darling visited Miss Foster in the handsome 3-story house. Whatever Mrs. Foster thought of another man's interest in Mrs. Wilson, and a tall, dark, handsome one at that, she didn't comment. She told him the Wilsons' arrival and departure dates and the fact they were newly married when they came and were very happy. Do you have a photograph of Mrs. Wilson I could have? Mrs. Foster hesitated. I'll see. And she produced one from an album in the sitting room. Sergeant Darling studied the slim young woman in the photo. She was laughing, posed by a railing with her hair blowing. There were mountains in the background, and he turned the photo over. Somewhere close to Banff, fondly Jessie, was written on the back in a young woman's handwriting. So now what we have is we have 2 different pictures of 2 different women, and we have 2 different samples of handwriting. That's a nice picture of her, he said. I'll return it to you. Do you have an address for Jessie? Yes, they left an oil stove and asked me to sell it. I did for $15 and sent the money to them in Vancouver. Another short search produced the address, 804 Homer Street. Darling now had a photo of Wilson's new wife, a sample of her handwriting, and confirmation that she had lived with Jack Wilson at the Vancouver address. Sergeant Darling next called at the Sutherland post office, where Eileen had written to Wilson, care of Miss Clark. They had no box number for Miss Clark. In fact, the only Miss Clark living in Sutherland had never heard of John or Polly Wilson. Sergeant Darling caught the 5:30 train back to Regina, arriving at about 12:30. So that's about a 7-hour train ride there, 200 kilometers. So again, just giving you some, like, they travel a lot, but it's a lot slower than what we're used to. Later that day, he typed the first confidential crime report, inquiry, re Mrs. M. Wilson, the first of a great many. Like a print in development tray, a shadowy picture was beginning to form. So they're starting to collect the pieces here, right? If you're thinking about this like a puzzle, they've established the frame of the puzzle. So chapter 33 is questions, questions, questions. People have suddenly wondered what was going on. Suddenly there were policemen everywhere you looked. They fanned out from Regina, Saskatoon, and Prince Albert detachments in every direction. It seemed on every train there were 1 or 2 Mounties stepping off at various points to question hotel clerks, post office employees, men who had scattered around the province and into Alberta after the military police disbanded, doctors, automobiles, agents, express agents, landladies, boarders, and many more. Letters, phone calls, and telegrams flew back and forth between the Saskatchewan detachments and crisscrossed the country between the prairies and the coast and to Polly's family in Scotland as the story unfolded. At the New Windsor Hotel in Saskatoon, the desk clerk who knew Wilson pointed to a registry entry for October 2nd, 1918, J. Wilson and wife. So that was where they had gone right after they got married. I know that woman well, the clerk said. She is old man Patterson's daughter from Blaine Lake. She brought a corsage in the train station the day she left for Saskatoon, Mrs. Hanson told Constable Chalk. She was always careful with money, but I think she wanted to look nice for her husband. They had had some troubles and it was a new start for her. What sort of troubles did they have? It had to do with another woman who lived at Blaine Lake. I never heard her last name, but her first name was Jessie. On inquiry at the Sutherland Post Office, Sergeant C.J. Hildyard of the Saskatoon Detachment learned that Wilson had rented Box 287 on October 19th, 1918, paying a year's rent in advance. In the early part of 1919, the postmaster received a letter from Vancouver for Wilson, advising him to direct all mail to General Delivery, Vancouver. One of the Saskatoon F Division main investigators was Detective Sergeant Alexander Drysdale, a Scot recently demobilized from the Cavalry Squadron. Sergeant Drysdale, a man of medium height with dark hair, gray blue eyes, and refined features, was described as Superintendent West, his commanding officer, as an educated man and a gentleman in every sense of the word. One of the few people Sergeant Drysdale interviewed was Fred Burge. The two men sat on wood crates drinking tea in the back of Burge's General Store in Blaine Lake. Oh yes, his first wife came over and caused a lot of trouble for him, or that's what his story was. What kind of trouble? She was as wild as a hare, I guess. You know, drinking, running around with men. He apparently couldn't do anything with her. Now, that's a throwback to way when he had talked about, oh, Jesse, will you marry me? I do still have my wife, but, you know, I was blackmailed into this, and she's this awful woman. There's those fake letters that he wrote for his supposedly dead sister. That's where that information's coming back. What happened to her? Did she go back to Scotland? No, she was killed in a car accident and then married a girl from here, John Patterson's daughter. How soon after the accident did he get married again? Awful damn soon. It had people's tongues wagging, I can tell you. Interesting, thought Drysdale. Back in Saskatoon that afternoon, Sergeant Drysdale bumped into W.C. Craig, an ex-stoker for the Battleford Royal Northwest Mounted Police, who had served in the military police under Wilson at Saskatoon. I wish I had time to talk over old times, but I'm on next train to North Battleford, Craig told him. I'll go with you. On the train ride, Craig confirmed Wilson's marriage to Jesse. We were all glad since he spent all his time in Blaine Lake, and we figured it would cut down on his boozing. And did it? Not much. But at least he was around, and when he was AWOL for quite a while, or we thought he was, but it turned out he had a bad case of the flu out in the country somewhere. Say, did you know Gillis, who went overseas with the cavalry unit? Drysdale was looking at dry snowflakes drifting past the train windows and onto the fields and bluffs. Snow made finding the grave a whole lot harder. It made everything harder. He shook his head. No, I didn't. Why? He lives at Blaine Lake. I could probably tell you more about what went on there. Sergeant Drysdale caught the next train from North Battleford to Blaine Lake. Back in Blaine Lake, Sergeant Drysdale talked to Mrs. Gillis over a cup of coffee in the local Chinese cafe. Aware of the other patrons' interest in their conversation, they kept their voices low. Yes, his first wife was supposed to have come to Regina before he married the Patterson girl. And what happened to her, the first wife? Well, he put out the story that she died in a car accident. But when he married Jesse right away, people said that his wife died very conveniently for him. Was she ever in Blaine Lake? You mean the first Miss Wilson? No, no one around here ever saw her. I guess he kept her away from here. Can you tell me anything else about it? Not really. Jesse Patterson was a lot younger than Wilson, and some said she did most of the courting. Did the second Mrs. Wilson know about the first one? Gillis shrugged. I don't think that she knew. People said she believed he was divorced. Maybe he thought his divorced wife came chasing after him. Who knows what he told her? Indeed, thought Sergeant Drysdale. Anyway, most of that talk went on after they were married and away from here. I don't suppose her folks would tell her. Perhaps not. Where can I find Miss Patterson? Mr. Patterson. Right across the street in the livery stable. He's usually there. Drysdale met Jesse's father, but just chatted about things in general before catching a train to Saskatoon. His orders were to catch the morning train to Regina. Okay. Holding back a sneeze. That's the worst. Telegraph keys were clacking, typewriters clattering, phone lines buzzing. Number 6020, Sergeant John Wilson, the cause of all the commotion, was on a train back to Vancouver to give more evidence at one of the Russian trials. Jesse stayed behind at the Grand Hotel in Regina. Part of this reason he's being sent there is because, again, the trains move really, really slow at this point in time. Like, he's on this train for a couple of days. It's given them some time. In Regina, Saskatchewan, November 2nd, 1919, 6020 left here for Vancouver Saturday night. Stop matter referred to Horrigan's letter July 31st. Very suspicious. He is not aware of the investigation being made. A.B. Perry. The day Jack left, Jessie wired her mother to come to Regina. Mrs. Patterson had wired back that she couldn't come and suggested Jessie come home to Blaine Lake, but Jessie stayed in Regina, anxiously waiting for Jack's return. Sergeant Hilliard paid a visit to Mr. Riddle, the gray Dort dealer. Riddle described the accident that happened, he thought, on September 27th, a couple days before Wilson came in with his new wife. He told me the government was going to pay for the new car. He only had to go to Regina and sign a requisition, so he asked for 15 days to pay. I went to the bank with him, and that's what he told the banker too. And where did the accident happen? Out near the Borden ferry somewhere. The two men went out there to haul in the burned car. Don't work here anymore. That was Southey and Walt Kellen, but I can tell you where they are now. Hilliard also spoke to Riddell's secretary, Jean Brown, who said that the Wilsons had introduced Jessie and said they were married the day before. He looked ready to jump out of his skin the whole time he was here. In fact, I thought he might be sick. On another visit to Rose Street, Sergeant Darlin heard from Eileen Wilsmer that after finding Jessie's letter, Polly felt very bad. She spent most of the time in her room preparing light meals on an oil stove there. She blamed herself for her troubles for not coming to Canada sooner. When Eileen had asked if her family knew of her troubles, she said they did not, and that she'd rather do anything than bring disgrace to her family. In Vancouver, Jack Wilson wasn't sleeping well. He sent the following message at 2:34 a.m. on November 4th. And so he's sending this to Regina, to Jessie. Leaving here tomorrow night for Regina. Did not know sooner. Wire me if mother has arrived. I will telegraph again in the morning. Jack. And then a copy made for the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. Wilson's telegram asked if her mother had arrived, seems to indicate that Mrs. Patterson was needed for something more than important than a pleasant family visit. And so this is a letter to Elizabeth Craig from the police. We just discovered Wilson remarried September 29th, 1918. The second wife mistaken for your sister. No trace of Mary Wilson since September 1918. Grave suspicions. Search energetically continued. Send certificate of marriage. So he's telling her that we haven't seen Polly. We made a mistake in identifying her. We need you to send Polly's marriage certificates over. And we haven't seen her for a year. So another one here. So 60-20, that is John Wilson, must be closely watched. Matter now looks very serious. Advise how long he will be required in Vancouver. Then have you 60-20 covered. Immediate reply required. Explain delay. Answer in my wire November 4th, which is this one here. So it's been a day and he's wondering, like, you haven't responded. And then he gets a response. Our cipher fifth stop 60-20 covered. So that's John. So John covered stop unable state yet when he can return. So he's not able to state when he can return. We'll notify you by wire. Stop forward an explanation. Inspector Newson's personal and confidential explanation, written the same day, informed the commissioner that Sergeant J. Fripps had been detailed to keep Sergeant Wilson under observation. He apologized for not answering Perry's wire of November 4th, but he had been waiting for something definitive to report. In the little town of Ardath, south of Saskatoon, Walt Kellen talked to Constable Chalk about the burned car he hauled into Saskatoon a little over a year ago. He recounted the trip to the culvert where with Jack and his new wife and the dinner Jack brought as a little wedding celebration. He supplied exact directions and drew a map to the culvert. In Vancouver, Sergeant Cather received a telegram on November 5th. Let me know at once if Sergeant Wilson left Wednesday for Regina. And this is from Mrs. Jessie Wilson. Sergeant Cather handed Jessie's wire to Inspector Newson. Newson looked at it and gazed out the window for a few minutes. It was still dark. It was a still dark day, the sky low and leaden. Wire her back and tell her he didn't leave Wednesday, but that he's leaving tomorrow. Yes, sir. He isn't leaving tomorrow, but if she's suspicious and investigation is being made, she might try and warn him. When do you think he will leave, sir? The day after tomorrow. I hope that on the night train. He's in bed today with a severe case of hemorrhoids. Inspector Newson raised his eyebrows and Sergeant Cather smiled. Will the trial be over then? No, but the commissioner asked that Wilson not testify at the perjury trial for obvious reasons. so our lawyer had his evidence placed in open court. Sergeant Phipps will accompany him into Regina. It will be interesting to follow this one, sir. Indeed, it will, Sergeant. Indeed, it will indeed. So this is probably the last chapter we're going to read today. Someone other than Mrs. Wilson. On November 6, 1919, Sergeant Drysdale asked the new express agent in Prince Albert for information regarding Polly Wilson's trunks. The agent wired Ned's story at the Great Northern Express in Edmonton. Some replied that Mrs. Wilson had advised them around the end of November 1918 that she was in the Sutherland Hospital with the flu and asked them to hold the trunks till she was able to call or send from them. She also asked what charges were against them. Story had promptly sent an invoice, but heard nothing further from Mrs. Wilson. Story concluded by saying that if no hospital record could be found of her, then he presumed that someone other than Mrs. Wilson wrote to the express office regarding the trunks. Commissioner Perry knew he wouldn't rest easy until number 6020, John Wilson, was safely back in Regina. The possibility of Wilson Bolton was very much on his mind, and he worried there might be a slip-up in Vancouver. He also wanted an officer he knew personally to accompany Wilson back to Saskatoon. So another telegram. When is 6020? John Wilson, leaving. Wrote you yesterday regarding the advisability of not using him as a witness in perjury cases. Sergeant Thomas transferred the depot and is to travel with 6020. So Sergeant Thomas is to travel with John Wilson and take every precaution against his disappearance. So he's being escorted. Sergeant Wilson and Sergeant Thomas boarded the eastbound night train on November 7th. Like Wilson, Sergeant Thomas was a Scot in his 30s. He'd emigrated to Canada in 1908 after 8 years in the British Army. And like so many others involved in the Wilson's investigation, he had served with the Royal Northwest Mounted Police's cavalry overseas. The two men wore identical uniforms, but the 6-foot-tall, fair-haired Thomas looked fit and at ease, while Wilson looked pale and strained, his uniform too large for him now. His posture was still straight, but he walked carefully, like a man in pain. Something else Wilson and Thomas shared was a fondness of the bottle. Thomas's energy and hard work would be rewarded with a promotion to inspector in early 1920. Then, guilty of intoxication, he would be transferred to Ottawa the following June, convicted on the same charge soon after, and dismissed from the force. As the train steamed west, Jack had a lot of time to think. He knew that when he got to Regina, he'd be interrogated about Polly's disappearance and his marriage to Jessie. It was strange. He could have written Polly's family that she had died of the flu. They'd have believed that, and possibly no one would have demanded a death certificate with so many deaths at the time. Why hadn't he? He didn't know himself, nor had he got rid of the dispatch bag and his incriminating letters to Jessie. His behavior seemed foolhardy, even to himself. Still, unless he confessed or they found Polly's body, they couldn't charge him with murder. So he's starting to realize that, crap, I screwed up. Because if we think about early in the story, he was quite tactical with a lot of his decisions, right? And it really seems that once he started drinking, that part of him really disappeared. He kept making mistakes. He couldn't get his story straight. So that seemed to really become an issue here. He played cards with Sergeant Thomas, and they talked about the old country and compared experiences. But as they drew nearer Saskatchewan, Wilson grew silent and his glances strayed off into the passing landscape. Jessie had been so excited by her first sight of the mountains. Green grass and mountains gave way to bare foothills and finally the gray, dun and faded blue of the prairies. In Saskatchewan, ground drift and snow obliterated the roads in places, swirled over the frozen ponds, and striped black summer fallow fields with waving white lines, like a carelessly drawn music staff on a blackboard. Sergeant Thomas lounged against the wall nearby when Wilson went to the bathroom, and Wilson felt his alertness as he paced the aisle to give himself some relief to his flamed hemorrhoids. He also understood the sergeant's glance in his direction when he himself came out of the washroom. And when Jack awoke from sleeping so soundly that he might have been dead, Thomas was sitting across from him, wide awake. They didn't need to worry. He wasn't going anywhere. On the long journey, the mournful cry of the train whistle echoed his empty feelings over and over. Polly's family was now even more distraught. They had been told the news of Wilson's marriage, but no news of Polly, except that no one had seen from or heard from her since she'd left for Saskatoon. And so we get a letter from Scotland to Perry, the commissioner. We received your letter yesterday, and I think, sir, the news it contains has nearly given me my death blow, and what it means to my dear father and mother is more than I dare think. Both my husband and I were too upset to write yesterday. Let me thank you for your great kindness in cabling the news as soon as you found how matters stood. We have known since March that there was something far wrong, but never thought for a moment that Wilson was so bad at heart as to abandon my sister in a strange land. Has he committed bigamy? For surely he would not be as guilty to the foul play to his wife, the mother of his 2 children. I will enclose her marriage license and will give you all the other information I can. The letter goes on for pages, giving every detail of their efforts to contact Polly and enclosing the cables and letter from Wilson to her husband, Archie. I will know that if Wilson deserted her, she would think shame and hide in her grief. She would not want to bring sorrow to father and mother, but oh, not knowing where she is a much greater sorrow to them. God help this poor woman if he married her and she does not know him. She can't be happy with such a scoundrel, for God will surely punish him, and yet he is the father of the 2 nicest wee children that ever lived. Mr. Perry, will you please cable when you find her, for it takes a letter so long to come. We will only be too pleased to pay for all the expenses if only we could bring back to happiness and joy my father and mother's hearts, lives. Again, thank you for your kindness and thoughtfulness to us, and also convey our thanks to Mr. Routledge for his kindness. And this letter would be from Elizabeth Craig. So the day before Elizabeth wrote to Perry, Walton Routledge had died on a train near Portland, Oregon. He was en route to California for his health and had left a wife and 3 children. So that was one of those 2 people who were initially investigated who left for health reasons. He dies. So right now, Polly's family thinks that he just abandoned Polly in Saskatoon. So G.S. Gobbin, the ex-accountant for the military police in Saskatoon, was happy to tell Sergeant Drysdale all about his service under Sub-Inspector Jack Wilson. Gobbin worked in the money order office at the post office where they sat down to talk. Wilson wasn't well known around here, you know. He was out of town most of the time, but I had my private opinion of him, Gobbin said. And what was that? I thought he was a rum customer, you know, always up to something. I kept the books about the MSA fines collected, and his seemed to be off more often than not. Did you ever report it? No, I didn't have any proof, and he was the boss, you know. Conrad Reed was hand in glove with Wilson. They were great boozing partners. I think he could throw some light on the matter for you if he will. Do you know where Reed is now? I think he's with your outfit in Vancouver. He thought Wilson was just it, but I thought he was a rum customer, and nothing he did ever changed my mind. That night, in a handwritten note to Commissioner Perry, Sergeant Drysdale wrote, the term hand in glove is usually used in one way only, and I am mentioning it so that if it is decided to interview Reed, and it seems essential, the knowledge of intimacy between the 2 could be borne in mind. In the back of Albert's Cafe, a favorite meeting place in Saskatoon, Sergeant Drysdale took time for lunch as he talked to James Martin, who also worked under the Wilson in the military police. I was transferred from Regina and was the senior man around the place, Martin said. Inspector Wilson was drinking heavily all the time. He was going to Blaine Lake right along to see his sweetheart, and the work was going to the devil. The waitress refilled their cups with strong coffee and set apple pie, day's desserts in front of them. Was he drinking on the job, do you think? I don't think, I know. Once he called Matthews and me into the washroom at the armory and asked us to drink to his upcoming marriage. I remember it well. He had a flask inside his tunic. Martin also recounted in detail the trip out to the burned car. I walked through the culvert that day, walking almost upright, he said. The grass was about 1.5 feet long in there, and I remember the slough was dry but muddy. Is there anything else you remember about the time of the accident? Nothing important, but Sergeant Reed was an intimate of Inspector Wilson's and would know all of his movements at the time. As Constable Chalk of the Saskatoon Detachment gassed up his car and gas station used by the military police, he asked the proprietor if he remembered Wilson. William Batchelor did, and furthermore, he remembered Wilson buying gas on the last Friday in September last year, and he said he'd been on his way to his wedding. On Saturday or Sunday, he came in again and said he had not been able to get a parson. I can't recall if he told me this or if I heard him say it on the phone. The picture in the development tray was suddenly changing, a shadowy image emerging here, another taking shape over there. The Mounties were now convinced that Jack Wilson had committed murder, and they suspected that Polly Wilson's body was buried somewhere in the vicinity of the burned car. They investigated a well near the culvert, and Constable Chalk reported that it was merely a sunk hole in the slough with some cribbing around it which had not been tampered with. They did not dig under the culvert. Long grass and weeds grew there, and James Martin had stated that this was the case at the time of Wilson's accident. Drysdale also talked to Charles McLean, who had visited Blaine Lake with Wilson and their wives shortly after Wilson's wedding. He recalled that when they passed by the burned car on the way, Wilson had told them that he had tried to fight the fire with his overcoat, burning the coat, but not putting out the fire. McLean said that Wilson took the burning of the car pretty easily. He showed no worry or nervousness, McLean said. If the police subscribe to the theory that the proprietor revisits the scene of the crime, then this would seem to be it. Wilson couldn't stay away from the place. He had visited the culvert the week after the accident at least twice with his new wife, and could have done so alone any number of times. He showed no worry or nervousness, McLean said, not judging by his actions then and later did he feel any remorse. Finally, on November 10th, the conductor called out, Regina, next stop, Regina, and the train squealed and huffed and finally jarred to a stop. As a pale Jack Wilson stepped off the train into a chill wind, he saw the car with two men from the barracks waiting. If they were concerned he might make a break for it, he would set their minds at ease. He walked briskly to the car, his back very straight, climbed in the back seat, and smartly shut the door. Sergeant Thomas got on the other side. At headquarters, he was read a discipline charge involving complaints about the way he'd handled witnesses in one of his undercover Vancouver investigations. And then this pronouncement: John Lindsay Wilson, you are dismissed from the service of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police as of October 7th, 1919. And he was led away to the guardroom. And so this is just a photo here of some of the RCMP commissioners. And well, yeah, there he is right there as well. Yeah, just a whole bunch of photos. Like we've seen a lot of cops' names. They're generally all located in this little like section here. And so if you're looking at these pictures here, so this is this road to Blaine Lake, and we got the culvert right here. And then finally, we have two guys who are digging for it. And you can see that this is in winter. It's November. And they are going to find the body. Just kind of a spoiler alert here. They are going to find it. Yeah. So we will take some pause there. I don't know if we're going to keep reading today. I just want to do a really quick plot summary here. There's a lot of details here, and we're kind of going to skim past a lot of them. Ooh, what's going on? Oh, why's my computer freezing? Sorry, my computer is freezing here.
For what chapter?
This is 32 to 34. Yeah, so again, there's a whole lot that happened here. We're actually gonna like skip a lot of it because a lot of it's just they're investigating the crime, right? That's really what it's all kind of coming down to. We already know all the lies that have happened throughout this story, but basically, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police investigate the crime. They are talking to. They talked to Wismer in Regina. They talked to Elizabeth Craig in Scotland. They're talking to the underlings of Wilson, like because he did lead a department. They're talking to like the Hutchinsons and anyone else who has had contact with Wilson in the story. So like, you know, they're talking to like the people who like man the desk at the hotel, right? Like the only person so far who hasn't really come up is that like pawn shop dealer that was in Vancouver. So they're gathering a bunch of evidence. They're investigating all this information. And so finally what ends up happening is they send Wilson back to, I'm going to add an arrow here. They send Wilson back to Regina. And this is where they formally charge him. Well, they formally yeah, charge him, I guess. They don't actually say like what it is just yet. And they also are sending someone to investigate the culvert. Sorry, not formally charge him. They formally dismiss him. They formally dismiss him. So I'll come up to this in a second if you're still writing, but just want to talk about this thing down here. Oh, sorry, this thing up here. So wait a minute. We might have to read a little bit more. Sorry, we are going to read one more chapter. I have lied to you. We will be reading one more chapter. I need to change that next year. Whoops. So we are going to read one more chapter. I apologize. We're going to read chapter 35. That's on page 145 of your book. Here we go. All right, so chapter 35, that's on page 145 of your book. We'll do one more chapter. And so this is chapter 35, a highly nervous condition. A few hours later, as he suspected, the real purpose of his trip became clear. He stood shivering across the desk from Inspector Prime with Sergeant Darlin seated to his right, a shorthand pad open. The window behind the inspector's desk framed a stiff, leaden November day. Wilson's legs trembled. Inspector Prime, a tall, thin man with strong features, looked at him in silence for what seemed like an eternity. Then it began. What has happened to your wife? Mrs. Mary Wilson. Mary's Polly, right? Her relatives in Scotland have been extremely worried about her. I don't know where she is. Why don't you know? We quarreled the day she arrived from the old country, and I haven't seen her since. And when was that? So sorry, actually some preface here. So it is going to be really important that we keep track here of what are lies and what are truths that he's telling. So this one right here, for example, is a lie. In fact, I'm actually going to change the color of that to, oh, I guess purple. That's close. I have to red. One should be 145. Yeah. So we are going to get a statement. We're going to get his official police statement about this. He's being charged. He's going to get charged with this disappearance, and he's going to make a statement. And so it's going to be important for us. Let's keep track here of what he's telling the truth of, what he's telling the lies of. Maybe it's 144. It's right after those pictures.
Right after the picture?
Yeah. Okay. So, where is Polly? I don't know. We quarreled the day when she arrived from the old country, and I haven't seen her since. And when was that? Almost the end of September last year, the 27th of September, I think. This one is a true statement. Like that kind of matches with the story. Obviously, he's lying about the fact they quarreled, but that's when she does like disappear last time he sees her. And when did this quarrel take place? Inspector Prime asked Drilly. Right here on the platform in Saskatoon. Sergeant Darlin wrote industriously. And what happened then? She walked away. I don't know where she went. Inspector Prime leaned back in his chair, crossing his long arms over his chest. And so on September 27th, 1918, was the last time you saw your wife, Mary Wilson. Is that correct? Yes. And you married Jesse Patterson of Blaine Lake on September 29th of 1918, and they both looked at Wilson, and he suddenly felt agitated. I did, and it was legal. I started the divorce proceedings before I left the old country, and they sent the papers here. He did, in fact, marry her, but it was, in fact, illegal because you cannot have two wives at the same time. And can you produce those papers? Sergeant Darlin's pencil was loud in the silence, and then it stopped. Wilson, answer the question. Can you produce the divorce decree? It's a long story. His lips trembled, his hands opened and shut. Lots of families' trouble enter in it. I want to make a written statement. And again, Wilson has realized he is not as sharp as he used to be here. He is, for all intents and purposes, a chronic alcoholic. His mind is not as sharp as it used to be. He has made mistakes. He wants to make a written statement. He has had time to think about this on the train. And so what we see here is his statement. Next page. So certainly, Sergeant Darlin, please escort the prisoner back to the guardroom and provide him with what he needs. And so he was taken back to the guardroom. A writing pad and pencil were placed on the table and the door locked. Jack Wilson sat down to write. It was terribly cold. There was no heat in the guardroom. He could not stop coughing, a deep rattling cough, and his hemorrhoids were deeply painful. He pushed his hands into his jacket pockets to warm them before he started to write. There was a hole in the right-hand pocket, and pushing through it, his hand closed on something hard that had fallen into the jacket lining. He pulled it up into the pocket and felt the smooth surface of a penknife he'd lost some time back. He held it in his hand until it warmed. Shivering, he dropped the knife back into the bottom of his jacket and picked up the pencil. So Jack Wilson is carrying a knife. So this is his official statement here. And you're going to see it goes on for a little bit here. So on New Year's Day, 1908, I married Polly Hutchinson of Slamanan in Stirlingshire. This is true, right? My parents were both dead and had left me considerable money. I invested all this money then in a field of glass houses and went into the tomato raising business. This is true. He was a partner in this, and she lived with me in one of my father's late houses. Also true. I will provide this for you, by the way, this whole thing. Oh my gosh, come on. Her brother then came into the business. which was extended considerably as he had only had a little money to invest, and then trouble commerce between he and I many times between her and I. So he was in a partnership with her brother, but John himself was the little guy in this. Her brother was the primary stakeholder. He was the guy who came in a little bit after with some money. So he's telling the truth in that he was invested with the brother, but he's playing up his importance with it. I worked night and day until June 1912. I booked a passage to Saskatoon on a Monday and sailed the next Sunday. Technically true. He doesn't explain that he escaped out of shame, but he's going with just the factual details here. Arriving in Saskatoon, I worked on a bridge building game until the next spring. We know that is true. He worked on the bridge. I forget what bridge that was. It was mentioned.
University.
Yeah, University Bridge. And when I quit and was employed by a gardener, I don't think he quit. I think he got laid off or something like that, if I recall, by the city until late fall. And then I went on a piece of land near Prince Albert and started a small garden and got hailed out the first summer just a few weeks before the war started. So I had to give it up. This is all technically true. I think this quit part is actually false, if I'm recalling correctly. I think he was laid off. So I'm not sure why he's lying about that. There's no real, he got laid off. There's no shame in that. The economy just went down. Then I went on a farm when the war started and immediately went to Prince Albert to enlist, but was rejected by the doctor. We know that this one is true. About 2 weeks later, I saw the Royal Northwest Mounted Police advertised for men, and thinking they would go overseas, I went before the doctor at Prince Albert and was accepted. True. I worked very hard and was sent to Blaine Lake Detachment in July of 1915 and did duty there, always trying to do my best. And for all rights and purposes, he was a good cop at first. True. During all this time, I had nothing to do with girls until the fall of 1916 when I became acquainted with Jesse Patterson. True, he kept to himself the entire time until he met the Pattersons. She was always so good to me and above everybody else. The friendship continued during 1917, and I tried again to get to overseas. And as I realized I was becoming quite serious, this friendship was becoming quite serious. So, was she good to him? Yes. Now, if we keep in mind here, though, he got sick with tuberculosis. Then that's when this friendship became serious. So he's changed the sequence of these events. He's saying, no, we became good friends. Then I tried to enlist, and then I got tuberculosis. When actually it's, I got tuberculosis, we became good friends, and I proposed, and then I tried to join. So these are technically like true statements, the events here, but the order of them is wrong. I was very sick all that winter, and Jesse Patterson looked after me and was very kind to me, even when stories were going around that I was a married man and then was a better friend than ever. She was absolutely pure and innocent in all this, and many nights I lay awake in bed trying to make up my mind to leave her for her sake, but I think that I was not in my right mind by this time and remained in Blaine Lake until April 1918. Generally speaking, pretty true here, right? I then went to the Prince Albert to enlist in the Royal Northwest Mounted Police Cavalry Unit and was rejected by the doctors at Prince Albert. Oh, true. There I learned that my first wife was in Regina, because that's when he got the phone call from her. I met her in Saskatoon, and here I behaved the worst, but my mind could not have been right, because we stayed in a room in Regina, but did not get along together, and I was very little there and could not keep away from Jesse Patterson. So he did meet her in Saskatoon. They did stay in a night in Regina, but we know that they immediately began, he immediately began his marital duties right then and there. So they did in fact get along quite well, but he still could not keep away from Jesse Patterson. So again, he's mostly telling the truth. There's little nuggets of falsities in there, or he's changing the order of some of the stuff sometimes. I was working for the Dominion Military Police at this time, having started at the beginning of May 1919, and was soon made sub-inspector as I worked in the office early and late to be away from the other woman. Now, generally speaking, true, but this other woman, the reason he was working so late was because he wanted to be away from, he wanted to be away from Polly, not from Jesse. Can I do? Okay, whatever, fine. She knew all about Jesse Patterson as soon as I told her all about her and how good she had been sick to me when I was sick and alone. Generally speaking, this was true. He did talk to her about Jesse, but just that they were friends and that this is a nice person who took care of him when he got really sick. She didn't actually really know about this, Jesse's true role in this until she found this letter. Although I believe I was out of my mind, then I was clever and cunning, and God alone knows how I told lies to Jessie, and she was so confident that she believed everything. I could not stay away from her, and when she moved to Prince Albert, I could not stay away from there, doing everything I could to make her happy, but doing wrong and not staying away from her. Generally speaking, this is true, right? He's just talking about, oh my God, I love her so much. I could not stay away from her, even though I know it was a bad thing to do. About the beginning of September, I was made the offer of chief inspector, but knowing that I was not fit for it, I rejected the offer and was sent to Saskatoon early in September to take charge of that division. So all of this is technically true. Now, the reason he declines the role, though, is because he doesn't want to be in Regina. He doesn't want to bring Jesse to Regina because people know about Polly's existence in Regina. He knew he could not be with Jesse in Regina. It would not work. So for the most part, it's true, but there's that little nugget of a line there. I wrote from Saskatoon when I arrived there, telling my first wife to come and I would meet her at Colonsay. And then the morning she left, I phoned her to come to Saskatoon instead, and that was on Friday in September 1918. True. I worked that forenoon at the office, and in the afternoon, I met the train with the car I had purchased from Erskine in Regina, and we went out in the country. This is true. He picked her up in the car, right? I was dazed and I have only a faint recollection of what happened, but she died on the way here. This is true. She did die on the way there. Here, Wilson wrote a line and then painstakingly crossed it out. Then I went to Blaine Lake and stayed there until Sunday. Jesse and I were married Sunday night in Saskatoon, and from that day, I did everything a man could do to make her happy. So yeah, his first wife did die that day. She died on the way. And then he did everything he could to make Jesse happy, and they got married and happily lived ever after. I was afraid every after that I'd be arrested and wired. That I would be arrested and wired Ms. Wismer from Saskatoon that everything was all right, and wired from Prince Albert that I was sick to send the trunks here. Now, this is where we get the lie. He did wire this. He wired this, but he signed off as Polly's name. So this is the forged letter where it was Polly who requested the trunks. There, I was very ill with influenza, and getting better, I came to Regina and re-engaged with the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. From that day, Jessie was made as happy as she could possibly be. I got her everything she had a liking for, and spent an awful lot of money taking her with me out west, dreading every day I would be in trouble. I seemed to get more cunning every day, and although dazed and weary, kept Jessie happy. Generally speaking, this is kind of true here. He got sick, they moved to Vancouver. God knows I did this lassie wrong, but every minute of the 14 months I was with her was happiness to me, in spite of my worry. I went to see her today and say goodbye, and true, the 14 months part's off. That's too short. We know from the timeline. I was with her. I was with her were happiness to me in spite of my worry. I had to see her today and say goodbye, and almost the last words she said were, "I trust you, husband." We don't know if that's true. We don't have any first-hand conversations that have happened yet. She is far and above any girl I've ever met, honest, true, and kind, and she never knew what I had to do to gain her. I had it in my mind that I must marry her legally, and I did it. He did not marry her legally. He was never officially divorced. Jesse, this is near the end, and when you read this, it was my love for you, all of this. And dearest wee wife, although I have ruined your life, it was done for love of you. Now you know what I was worrying about many times when you asked me. Better for you had I never met you, and that you had gotten your life's happiness, you deserved your own kindness. So generally speaking, Jesse, the reason I did all this is because I loved you. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Now this part though, the reason I did this, my dear sweet wife, that's oh no, sorry, no, this is still talking about Jesse. Yep, this is all still true. This is all about Jesse. This further certifies that my wee girlie never dreamt, but when I had got a proper, but what I had got a proper divorce. She many a time asked me for her papers, meaning the divorce papers. So we know that he did not produce these papers. And that is the end of his statement. I will provide that for you. It'll be uploaded on the LMS very shortly after. But trembling with exhaustion, he lay down on the cot and stared at the ceiling. After a while, Jack got up and went back to the table, walking bent and stiff like an old man, and picked up the pencil. P.S. Father and mother, be merciful to Jessie. She is not to blame for the terrible shock this will give you when you hear that I have brought shame on your girlie Jessie. Now, he's not talking to his parents. His parents are dead. He's talking to Jessie's parents. In the small hours of the morning, the prisoner still hadn't slept. He began to cough and couldn't stop, sitting up on the edge of the cot, coughing until he spat up blood. He got up and looked at his statement, then took the knife from his pocket and lay down again. Around 4 a.m., he pushed the point of the blade into his throat on the left side and made a little cut. Oddly, he felt no pain. He was very shaky, and he steadied his right hand with his left as he cut the gash wider. Blood poured down and around his neck. He stopped and lay still for a while. Then he raised the knife again, steadied his hand once more, and opened the wound several more inches. His arm fell limp, still holding the knife. Suddenly, his head cleared. What had he done? He didn't want to die. Blood kept coming into his throat, making it hard to swallow. He put his hand up inside the wound and felt what had to be done. Felt his pulse beating wetly in his hands. He should tell the guard, but he didn't want to because they would have to get the doctor out of bed. He would wait till morning. The corporal would be in at 7 o'clock. So he slits his throat and he's like, oh, I don't want to inconvenience the doctor, so I'll sit here for 3 more hours. Corporal Hutchinson thought Wilson was dead, lying there with his eyes closed, white as driven snow except for the blood, the ghastly, jagged gash from ear to ear, oozing bright, fresh blood on the top of the darker dried shirt. On top of darker dried blood, his shirt collar and the top of the blanket soaked with it. Here, said Wilson, scaring Corporal Hutchinson half out of his wits. Here, holding out the bloody penknife with a pale, blood-stained hand. Then Wilson smiled at him. Corporal Hutchinson never forgot it. So this is the letter sent to the commissioner on November 11th, 19. This is exactly a year after the war ends. Exactly 1 year. Regarding prisoner Wilson, I have the honor to report that I was called early this morning to see the name above prisoner who had cut his throat very severely. Again, I'm honored to report that he cut his throat. That's what he's saying here. So very, very harsh words. Fortunately, no large vessels were cut. I dressed the wound and sent him by ambulance to the general hospital as a number in the muscles and neck are cut and operation will be performed this morning. The wound is about 7 inches long. I therefore will be unable to be at orderly room. I have the honor to be, sir, your obedient service, T.A. Morrison, surgeon. On November 12th, Commissioner Perry wrote to the Royal Northwest Mounted Police comptroller in Ottawa, giving a complete report of the Wilson case. As this was now a matter for which a criminal charge would be laid, he notified the comptroller that the investigation would be handed over to Superintendent Charles Mahoney, head of the Saskatchewan Police Department. Now, if you remember that name, that's the dude in the prologue, way back when we first started the book. Together with an offer of cooperation on the part of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, he pointed out to the comptroller that Wilson did not re-engage with the force until January 6, 1919, 3 months after the suspected crime was committed. As soon as Wilson could be moved, he would be transferred to the provincial jail with criminal charges preferred against him by the provincial authorities. On November 11th, Inspector Prime, following Commissioner Perry's instructors, turned over a copy of the complete file, Mary Wilson missing, to Superintendent Mahoney. He also forwarded a cardboard box containing letters, papers, and photographs found in Pauline Wilson's trunks. Those trunks from the train station. A new class of players was about to step on the stage, but the old ones were not rushing for the wings. On November 13th, Commissioner Perry wrote to Superintendent Horgan requesting that Agent 35, which is Conrad Reed, which is that, that's his buddy, right? That's Wilson's buddy, his drinking buddy, be interviewed regarding Wilson's personal family affairs and any light he could throw in the car accident. Secure this information with the least possible delay. Get it immediately. Then on November 13th, the newspapers broke the story. Okay, so that is where we actually will end off. So we will end off on there. And so I will make this whole thing available to you. I'll upload to the LMS in like, I don't know, like 10 minutes. The only real things we have for like our plot summary here is that Wilson writes a statement. He attempts suicide and survives. That's it. That's all that's actually happened in that story. So he wrote a statement, he attempted suicide, and he survived. Oh, this is just on page. I wrote this on page 22. Give me a second. So we will finish this book tomorrow. We will be doing a lot of reading tomorrow to kind of finish it up, but that will be the end of it. So we will officially be done the book tomorrow. Now, one thing we are going to do is we are going to do oh, whoops, I see my mistake. I was supposed to move this. Just down here, last one. That's my bad. So in that statement here, so that's page 145 to 148. I'm just wanting to get you guys to try and put in at least 3 things that are true and 3 things that are lies, and preferably with an explanation as to why they are lies. To try and find some evidence that, like, contradicts this information. So today, the rest of the morning will just be, you'll have time to do this. If you're missing that timeline assignment, that is due on Tuesday. So it's time to finish everything up, because tomorrow, like, we will literally just be reading. We will just be powering through the rest of the book, because we got about 50 pages left to go. So it's just time to be able to finish up all of that. So you'll be working on this thing that's on page 23. So you're working on this thing on page 23. If you have any questions up here that you have to do, you have time for that. But generally speaking, it's just time to finish this up as best you can. Finish up the timeline assignment. Finish this up. This one is an assignment. This one is due December 7th. Sounds right. This one should be really short. Frankly, this kind of should be free marks. Now, this thing we did together. Oh. Here we go. This thing, I'm going to upload this to the LMS in like 5 minutes. Okay. So I'm just going to screenshot this, colors and all. I'm going to upload that. You're welcome to use that, or you can just go straight into the statement yourself that's on those 3 pages.